was they had my dealer's phone tapped. So when I called him and I offered him that money, they considered me to be an investor in his drug business. So at the time, they dropped a pretty wide net. They scooped up like 25 people, drug kingpins, you know, my dealer's associates, people I didn't know. I didn't know any of those people except my dealer that I was arrested with. And I tried to tell them, you know, they'd made this huge mistake, but they didn't care.
It made you link to them.
Yes. They told me as far as they were concerned, I was as guilty as the kingpin was, and I was looking at 10 years in prison.
Wow.
So I remember sitting in the back of the police van and had my hands zip tied behind my back. And I remember thinking, well, my gosh, my life is over. And, you know, I know now that it was. And it was the best thing that could ever happen to me because that old life was over. And there, I remember when I first went into jail, I looked around and I was still feeling pretty cocky at that point, you know, that it hadn't hit me just how serious this was. And there was nothing to read in there but Bibles. And I remember making this comment, you know, because by that time I could not have been farther from believing in Jesus. And so there I am in that jail, and one of the women who was in there on federal charges started, you know, when I told her, why is there nothing to read in here but a Bible? I remember she told me, she goes, you'll figure it out pretty quickly. And so then I got denied getting out on bond on my first appearance and came back, and I wasn't so cocky anymore. You know, that's when it started hitting me, and then the withdrawals started hitting. And I was a wreck. And one of those women told me, she said, you think this is bad? She said, wait till you see hell. And that was all it took.
Where do you see
Wait till you see hell.
hell? Wow.
And I went back into my cell, and it was so overcrowded they didn't even have a bunk for me. They had one of these old plastic like canoe boats that laid on the floor that I was sleeping in. And I got down on my knees and I asked Jesus to forgive me. And I asked him to come into my heart, and of course I asked him to get me out of trouble. Yeah, and I got up and didn't feel any different, and except this, I wasn't feeling the fingernail anymore. You know, all of a sudden, for the first time in longer than I can remember, maybe since age 12, you know, that fingernail and that drive had stopped. And I was like, wow, that's, you know, I think it took a couple of years before I realized that I was healed from the addiction in that moment, because I always waited for it to come back. But maybe it was just because I was scared. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. It never returned. I'm 13 years past that date and have never again felt that. Never. You know, just such a miracle. And, you know, I knew at that point I better call my mom and my stepdad, who I call my dad. So I called them and told them where I was. And they told me that they told me they loved me. That was the first thing my dad told me. He said, we love you. And that was just what I needed to hear. I didn't hear, you know, I can't believe you've done this to us, you know, or anything like that. You know, we love you. What can we do to help? And I told them there was probably nothing that they could do. And they said, well, we're going to pray. I'm like, yeah, right. Okay. You know, still quite the scoffer. And so they started praying, and they started getting in touch with friends locally and across the country. I'm surprised they didn't call you. And told them to pray. And 2 days later, I was released on bond. We were released on my own recognizance, which was so unheard of for a federal case that they had to actually look up the process on how to let me out the front door instead of going out the back. Yes, but unfortunately, they weren't going to let the charges drop.
Oh, wow.
They'd done a lot of talk about that 10 years, whether or not they could get me out from under that, because that was a minimum mandatory sentence. And so by the time when I did wait for the year, my mom and dad were taking me to church with them. You know, I started going to Bible study. I had some strong, strong believers that were really sowing seed into me. And I remember telling the Lord, you know, that starting to develop this relationship with him. And I remember at one point somebody came and prophesied over me and told me that they thought I was going to have a prison ministry. So I remember thinking about that, and I'm like, all right, Lord, I will surrender to this thought of prison ministry. I just didn't think it would be on the inside. God's sense of humor, because I did get sentenced to prison, and I was sentenced to a year and a day, and which was a huge mercy. At the time I didn't think it was, but it was a huge mercy, especially that extra day, because that extra day meant good time.
Like what you saw? Make sure to comment and like below. Hit that subscribe button for more content uploaded weekly.